We're pleased today to have Dr. Sophia Arjana with us, talking about Islam and sexes and sex and all this fun stuff. Um, Dr. Arjana just published a book very recently on Islam, Muslims and the Imagination. Is that correct?
Muslims in the Western imagination.
Muslims and the Western Imagination, with Oxford Press. So, and I hear it's doing quite well.
Yes, it is.
Good, good, good. So let's just get right into it. Tell me, why are Muslim women so oppressed?
Right. Well, Muslim women are oppressed in certain Muslim communities, right? So we have, you know, places like the KSA, the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, certainly places like Afghanistan, certain areas of Pakistan where you do have, women's bodies being controlled, right, and being abused by men, and particularly patriarchal interpretations of the tradition. And then you have other places where you might have something like a dress code, and you definitely have issues surrounding gender, like in the Islamic Republic of Iran. But there it's a little bit more complicated, right? Because women drive, women serve in parliament. There's been female vice presidents. There's female judges. This kind of thing. So sorry about that. So, it really differs greatly. So, I mean, one of the things to kind of think about with the issue of, oppression in Islam is that it's a given fact, right, that religious systems are often, embedded in patriarchy, right? And that goes for a lot of different religious traditions. And certainly Islam has some issues with gender and sexuality that need to be worked out. But you can't really say, Muslim women as a collective identity, right? Because there's Muslim women that are human rights lawyers that have very kind of healthy, marriages and sex lives, and there's women that are, put, to death in Kabul for infidelity, right? So I mean, there's these huge differences between the lives of different Muslim women, right? And one of the really useful texts to look at with this question is this book by Laila Abu Lugod called "Do Muslim Women Need Saving?", which I actually wrote a review of recently. And she kind of looks at the whole discourse of Western feminism and how it talks about Muslim women. And that's a really useful book, right? Because she kind of goes through a lot of the discourse, and even a lot of stuff like kind of popular fictionalized accounts of the lives of Muslim women, right? So I mean, it's complicated, and when we get to talk about texts, and when we look at, okay, well, how do Islamic texts treat Muslim women or the issue of gender? There's a vast difference between the way that the Holy Quran treats women and the way that other traditions like Hadith treat women, right? And so one of the things that's happened in the past couple decades is there's kind of been this move among a lot of Muslims, not just in the West, but I would say more so in the West, that are saying, I'm becoming a kind of Quranic central Muslim. Like, I'm not so interested in these other traditions, right? And that's certainly the position of Amina Wadud. And in the introduction to her book, Quran and Women, she talks about that, right? She says that, I'm really not that interested in the Sunnah or the Hadith, which is these traditions and stories about the Prophet, because they're recorded by men. We kind of know how that goes. So I'm really kind of putting my faith in the Quran, which is the Word of God. And there's really very little in the Quran that's objectionable about women. There's one verse that's 434 that's kind of problematic and has been translated in some unfortunate ways, right? But the story of, let's say, the creation of humans is quite gender friendly. And then the story in the Quran of the fall of man is all Adam, right? Eve is not even part of it. But a couple hundred years later, we have a hadith that suddenly pops up in some attic somewhere, right? And then the hadith says, oh, well, the Quran doesn't mention women, but actually it's all women's fault, and women are kind of, devils in disguise and all this kind of stuff. And there's a really fantastic article about the about how that particular narrative changed. That's written by Barbara Stowasser. That's about Eve and about how the whole kind of concept of Eve changes, right? So these are kind of complicated issues, but certainly the Western discourse about Muslim women is that they are universally oppressed, right? So if we look at where do the majority of Muslim women live, right? The majority of Muslim women in the world live not in the Arab world, right, or in the Middle East, right? This area that the West has kind of made up to describe a certain colonial venture, right? But most of them live in Indonesia, and Indonesia is, certainly not perfect about gender, but women have pretty good legal rights. It's basically a democracy. Women work, women drive, women hold basically the same positions as men, and they hold positions in politics. So, that is usually not the example, though, that we hear. It's usually something like Afghanistan or the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. And, honestly, the KSA, the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, is really viewed by most Muslims as kind of an infidel state. Like, their kind of version of Islam is not considered by, a lot of Muslims really very Islamic, right?
So let's play with this Western imagination for a second.
Okay.
If the imagination is that all Muslim women are being oppressed, then France answer to it with its secularism and piercing the veil or eliminating the veil becomes a way of what does that mean when we force women who want to wear a veil not to wear a veil?
Right. I mean, so this is an issue that's come up, right, in France, and it's come up, to some degree in Turkey, at least in the past. So, I mean, the issue is that Muslim women are kind of caught in this damned if we do, damned if we don't, space, right? So, if we wear hijab, right, if we wear some kind of veil, there's a whole segment that's like, oh, you're oppressed and poor you, and you must not be able to leave the house, and there's all this kind of stuff, right? And it is true that there are Muslim communities where, as I said, they're very patriarchal, and women's bodies are controlled that way. I mean, certainly, right? Now, on the other hand, this idea of, you can't wear the veil, and I'm going to tell you how to dress, that is a very kind of, also a way to control and punish women's bodies. So, one of the issues that comes up is, female agency. So there's some good work on this, on the veil, how the veil can be used for, subversively, right? Or how it can be used as an anti-colonial kind of dress and those sorts of things. And there's a really wonderful film that DU has a copy of that I wanted to say something about, and it's called The Noble Struggle of Amina Wadud, and it's about Amina Wadud's life, basically, in her work. And she makes this statement in the film that's really powerful, where she says, even before she became Muslim, because her ancestors were stripped naked and put on the auction block as slaves, she dressed modestly, and she covered her body, right? So one of the, issues that comes up is there's, different ways that Muslim women, do take control of their body, right? And France doing this thing of like, oh, well, you can't be modest, is really the same thing as the Islamic State of Iran saying you have to veil. I mean, there's really no difference there, right? Because they're both trying to control women's bodies. And really for Muslim women, it's just like whatever they do, somebody's mad at them, right? So if it's not kind of the kind of patriarchal, kind of conservative folks in their community, then it's like the West, right? You wear a veil, you're oppressed. And one of the things that some Muslim women have started to do is to just wear the veil in certain situations, right? Because there's certain situations where it is actually advantageous to wear the veil, right? And there's certain situations where it clearly is not, right? So I have more status automatically than Amina Wadud will ever have, even though she's about, 50 times more brilliant than I will ever be, right? Because she is, this incredible figure in Islamic studies. No, sorry. Right? But I have, more right, authority and status because I'm white,
Mm.
right? Automatically when I walk in a room, right? And so one of the things about the veil is that there's certain moments when my privilege actually will go down if I'm veiling, and there's certain it will be diminished. My privilege and my status will be diminished, and there's certain situations where if I wear it, it'll go up. Right. And that's kind of the whole thing about the veil, right? It's a very, very powerful symbol, and people think of it in these kind of vastly different ways.
So when I hear some white feminists speak, um, it seems as though there is this desire to save the Muslim women from these heavy patriarchal cultures,
Right.
in their own imaginations. Um, what would you suggest that white feminists should be doing to stand in solidarity, but not to impose a Western understanding of feminism?
Yeah, I mean, this is, I think, real hard for white feminists and for Western feminists, even if they're Muslim, right? Because the way that Western feminism, Western feminism very much is situated in thinking about liberation through the body. And that's historically kind of how it's been thought about, right? And this really great little book by Laila Abu Lughod, who's actually speaking at CU in 36 minutes or 46 minutes, which I won't see today. She kind of talks about this, right? So, it's very hard to, I think, for Western feminists to disengage from that. I think one of the things, for me is, a white scholar who happens to be Muslim, is I really try to not exert my privilege when I'm with Muslims of color, and especially Muslims who have been Muslim a lot longer than me. And that is particularly true of African American Muslims, because African American Muslims are the oldest group of Muslims, right? So there's this whole kind of thing about white converts, right? That is a real issue in Islam, and there's a really great kind of queer theory scholar in Canada. His name is Mahdi Taraj, who's a friend of mine, and he wrote this fantastic article. It's really good, and it's in a journal that looks at religion and performance and the body, and it's about the fetish, the way that white converts are fetishized, right? Is like, oh my God, we have a white convert, right? So, we have to be really careful about that within Muslim communities, right? With holding the white Muslim up. And we're not actually really good at that in the United States, because, like, there's this hero worship of people like Hamza Yusuf, of Sheikh Hamza, right? And whereas, like, his colleague that's black is, like, not, that isn't the case with him, right? And so, this is a real issue now when it comes to people outside the tradition. Maybe the thing to do is to really look at what Muslim women want, right? And so, one of the things Laila Abu Lughod talks about in her book is she talks about, well, like, the veil and removing it or not wearing it or whatever, that is about number 50 on the list of concerns that Muslim women have. Right? Because most Muslim women are really, focused on, I don't want to say like more important stuff, but that might be the way that, dress is just about the last thing, right? It's like they want access to education for their kids. They want to not be blown up by a suicide bomber or have a American drone dropped on their house. They would like health care. They would like a stable infrastructure, these sorts of things. One of the things that comes up too is, like equal access to the mosque, right? These kinds of things. So it's kind of like the veil is just kind of not, not on the list. The other thing is that, the way that Western feminists and the West kind of thinks about the veil is it's very hard for them to think about the veil not being an oppressive piece of clothing. And honestly, for a lot of, Muslim women, including those living in the West, it is actually the opposite. It is actually viewed as something that improves your relationship with Allah, that, is kind of a marker of your inner piety, right? and a host of other things. And one of the reasons, that some Muslims in the West don't wear it, I mean, to be honest, the reason I don't wear it is because I'm afraid if I wear it, I'll be subject to violence. And I think we can see that clearly is happening. And I mean, maybe the jury's out on what happened in Chapel Hill, but like clearly, I mean, two of the victims of that crime were muhajahabat. They were wearing the veil, right? And so, I mean, this is an issue, right? Because there's so much Islamophobia in the West, right, that this actually is going into people's decisions about what to wear the veil. I think it's really hard to go back to your question, about like how do Western feminists, how should they deal with this? And I think the first thing they need to do is listen, right? And I think that what happens is that often there's just such a kind of powerful emphasis on the body, and we want to help you throw off the burqa, right? And you could kind of see this discourse with Afghanistan, right? Under the veil, beneath the veil, throwing off the burqa, that all that kind of business, right? That there's not really a space to actually listen to the real concerns of these women. And a lot of Muslim women, outside of places that have like stable, governments and that are pretty decent countries to live in, like Indonesia's, pretty nice country. I mean, I've spent time in Iran, and I mean, there's some stuff there you have to deal with, but like they have a good infrastructure and good healthcare and that kind of stuff. So maybe they're a little bit more interested, maybe like in the veil. But for a lot of Muslim women who live in places that are war torn or that are ISIS is running around killing people or whatever, they just don't really care. I don't think. Yeah. So. I think it's more issue for the West,
For those who are listening to our conversation months from now, I think you're referring to an event that occurred in February of 2015 in where 3 individuals, Muslims, were shot by an atheist over a parking space. And as you said, the jury's not out, but it seems that because they were Muslims was probably one of the reasons for that violence.
Yeah, I mean, the kind of discourse about this crime from a lot of the media is that this happened over a parking space, and it came out today that the male victim was severely beaten, like his face was beaten in first, and then he was shot, and then the 2 women were shot, and that actually the three Muslims that were killed were constantly just treating this man with kindness, like take the guest parking space. Mashallah, kind of thing. And so, the FBI is investigating, and I mean, I'm going to guess that as more information comes out about this, that this will be probably prosecuted as something more than something about a parking space. This, I mean, I need to say here because of my work, this was bound to happen. I mean, this is so horrific, and I actually. I mean, my whole family has just been kind of, really very, very upset by this, right? But, there's kind of the discourse about Muslims in the United States is so vicious that, if you have somebody like this man who did this, who might be unstable or might be whatever, eventually that is going to turn somebody to do something like this, right? And, we know this because of the history of anti-Jewish rhetoric. We know this because of the history of this country and the, horrible crimes against other communities. So this is actually quite serious. And this actually is not the first incident of this. But, over the past couple of years, the kind of fervor against Muslims has just become worse and worse and worse. And what's, I think so sad about this is that these 3 individuals were, very, very godly, and dedicated their whole lives to helping people. And the gentleman that was killed, he had a charity that, did dental work for, he was a dental student for Syrian refugees in Turkey, and he was helping the homeless in Chapel Hill all the time, and the same with his wife, and the same with the other victims. So, I mean, there's a level of, sadness about this simply because of the fine characters of these 3 people. But, the more we go on with failing to challenge the, just extreme hate, which is what it is, against communities, whether they're Jewish or Muslim or immigrant communities or LGBTQ folks, we're going to have this. Like, we're going to have these horrible things happen.
So maybe going back to what we were talking about before, just to reiterate what you're saying, we should be maybe less concerned with what a Muslim woman wears and more concerned with the protection of her life while walking the streets of the United States.
Yeah,
That's where our emphasis should probably be.
That would be nice if people were concerned. And one of the issues that the veil raises and this whole thing about Muslim women raises is that, there is a kind of obsession, right, in general about women's bodies, no matter who they are. And you can see that, I didn't watch the Grammys last week, but there is a whole commodification of women's bodies. Yes. And I think that, when it comes to Black bodies or bodies of color, there's a whole other thing going on, right? So, that is one of the things that's going on here, is that there is this obsession with, controlling the bodies of people who are still viewed in some way as colonized, right? And that's one of the things here. That's one of the things that's going on. And so it's very hard to kind of get people to stop doing that, right? And start thinking about, what would it be like if we actually tried to get to know these people and were caring about their communities and all that.
So let me shift gears a little bit and tell me a little bit about the LGBT community within Islam and how that relates to Quranic teachings. And of course, every country has a different understanding, but more or less, if you give us a little bit of an understanding of what's happening.
Yeah, okay. So, I've taught this course at ILIF twice, which is this Islam, Gender, and Sexuality course. And one of the books we use is a book that I think the title is Before Homosexuality in the Arab Islamic World or something like that. And it actually looks at what happens to notions of sexuality in pre-modernity and modernity. And as you know, because you're an expert on this, and we have other colleagues like Ted that looks at this a lot, like Ted File, right, that looks at what happens in modernity. So in pre-modernity, just to be really clear, male homosexual desire is looked at as completely normal. Like, this is just how it is, and some men like it, right? Acting upon those desires, and I'm going to speak a little bluntly here, by having anal sex was punished under the Ottoman legal system, but not as harshly as infidelity between a man and a woman in a marriage. And there is a whole cycle of these stories in the Sufi tradition, right? Not just in Ottoman Turkey, but all over, where male Sufi teachers had these young, kind of hairless male students, right? And they had affairs with them, and this was well known. And in fact, there was even almost, we have records of these kind of competitions about like, well, my student is kind of cuter than your student, right? So this is something that is just the way it was, right? And as you know, when modernity happens, there's a whole kind of thing that happens about, wanting to force people to identify, and everything has to be categorized, and you have to be this and you have to be that. And, in pre-modernity under the Ottoman system, which was a lot of the Muslim world, right, the way that sexuality was viewed was on just a huge spectrum. So you kind of had, like John Wayne at one end and, RuPaul at the other, and like Barack Obama in the middle, right? I mean, it was just like you were somewhere on there, but you weren't necessarily like, one or the other, right? And in modernity, we have this whole thing about this, right, which is now being challenged, right? Now we're kind of starting to see this effort to talk about sexuality in kind of more fluid ways, right? So, I think that's important to say, that it hasn't always been this horrific for queers in Muslim communities. And it's pretty horrific, I think, in a lot of Muslim communities, although not all of them. The other thing to say is, just like other religious texts that, conservative Christians, for example, will say, oh, well, the Bible says all this stuff about homosexuals. Well, of course it doesn't, because there's no concept of homosexuality 2,000 years ago. So it's just something they've just kind of made up. So what does the Quran say about? Well, the Quran basically says, raping men is wrong. Like, that's, I think, most religious traditions, I would hope, would say that, right? And it's the usual kind of stuff about Sodom, right? I mean, it's that usual stuff. So, what kind of examples do we have in the early Muslim community? Well, we have, different hadiths. And one of the hadith that I usually talk about in my classes is that this man goes to the prophet and he said, Prophet, I found, I witnessed these two men having anal sex, so we need to kill them. And the prophet kind of looks at him and says, we don't kill people who pray with us. Right? So that's an example that, activists are using, right? So not only do we just kind of have not really anything in the Quran, but we have that example. And even if we didn't have that example, the whole ethic in Islam is mercy and compassion. So you have to extend that to everybody in the community, right? Now, all that being said, there are a lot of Muslim communities that are, executing queers, especially men, especially gay men, for the way they are and the way God made them, right? And that's a huge problem, right? And we see this in Iran, and we see this in, different Muslim communities all over the continent of Africa, and we see it in a variety of other places. There's also, starting to be spaces opening for those members of our community. So, my husband and I, we don't go to a mosque in Colorado because we don't really want to be part of a religious community that doesn't openly accept all of our brothers and sisters. So what I do is I Skype in, not every week, but whenever I can, I Skype into this mosque in Toronto, which is called the Toronto Unity Mosque, which was founded by Lori Silvers and Alfred Kaki, and it's a queer-friendly, gender-neutral mosque, right? And there's all these other folks all over the country who set up similar spaces. So there are kind of spaces for Muslims, right, who are not, functioning clearly within the confines of heteronormativity, right? And there's starting to be more spaces like that. But, this is very connected to gender, right? Because the more entrenched people are in their, ideas of this is how you be a man and this is how you be a woman, the more messed up they are about these other questions. And we know that, right? So we know if there's kind of a more fluid understanding of gender and men are not having to perform gender as these kind of hyper-masculine folks, right? And women are kind of allowed to be in different spaces and that kind of stuff. We usually, have less of this. And so, one of the issues in Islam that's important is that, these issues about queerness are not going to go anywhere until the issues about gender are addressed, right? And so, one of the things that comes up, it happens quite a bit, is that Muslim men and women who are queer are just kind of like, well, I guess I'll get married and go ahead, because my family will lose their minds, right? And so, this is something that, is very, very painful. And that, honestly, Islam is not, dealing with, Muslim communities, if you look at them collectively, which I don't really like to do because they're very different, this is something that we're just really starting to deal with, and we're not, I don't think dealing with it particularly well, right? Just to be honest about it.
And I think what you're saying, one of the things that you're saying that we need to really keep in mind, it really needs to be emphasized, is that when we talk about Islam or Muslim community, there are multiple communities with multiple cultures and multiple ways of dealing with this, and where some might be a little bit more oppressive and others might be more liberating. So there's not a homogeneous community, is what I'm hearing you say.
That's right. So I'm married to an Indonesian, and we have this kind of little Indonesian CU group. It's like we get together, usually once a month for a potluck. And so, it's very interesting because there's somebody in that community who is he's probably, say maybe 23 or 24. And he wears more makeup than everybody, all the women in the community, always has a new, Coach bag and the whole thing. And there's just nothing, everybody accepts him, right? It's just fine, and I think, I mean, I've heard these stories from my husband about, different folks he grew up with in Indonesia that everybody just kind of knew, and it was just kind of like,
Yeah.
yeah, right? So, I mean, there's a lot of that too, right? And then there's other places like where literally, people are, scared to death that they'll be found out.
Yeah.
Right, and it really depends. And I mean, I think even in Indonesia, I'm sure. I mean, I've never been there before, but I'm sure if you're in Banda Aceh, you probably better move if you're queer. Whereas if you live in Jakarta, it's probably I'm sure, a whole scene there that you could be part of.
I mean, I taught a class in Yogyakarta in
Right.
Indonesia some years back, and a group of the students, and I would hang out with them. We would go out drinking. And some of the students, women were wearing the hijab, and at the same time, some of the students were very openly out.
Yeah.
And we went to a very public place, and no one cared.
Yeah.
It was just, I feel like I might as well have been in New York City, where no one really cares. But in the same sense, I think if a similar group was to go to some small town in Alabama, or some small town here in Colorado, they would receive probably as much pushback as many in other parts of the world. So it's complex, I think, is what we're saying.
Yeah, and I mean, one of the problems whenever we're having conversations about Islam is because of Orientalism, right, and because of the West's colonial history, both Europe and the United States, colonial history with different Islamic communities or Muslim communities. It's very hard to get people to think outside of like all Muslims do this. And so the thing I always start off with my class is I always have them list, with intro to Islam, I usually do this exercise, tell me 5 things you know about Islam, and then I just rip the 5 things apart. And usually one of them that people say is, oh, all Muslims pray 5 times a day. And then I'm like, no, they don't. Some Sunnis pray 5 times a day. Shia pray 3 times a day. Where do they pray towards? Mecca? No, not everybody does, actually. There's a whole group of Muslims that prays towards a shrine in Iraq. So there's this whole kind of thing you have to do, right? Yeah.
You mentioned Orientalism. Can you maybe spend a few moments telling us what that means?
Yeah, so Orientalism is defined in different ways, but Orientalism is the discourse that sets up this binary between the Orient or the East, which is associated with Islam, and the West or the Occident, which is associated mostly with, when it was first invented and developed, with Europe. And this is what has been used historically to, validate colonial conquests in places like Egypt, right, and other places in North Africa. And the way that it kind of works is by setting up almost like, if you had the West on one side, right, in a line in the middle, and the East on the other side, right, or Islam on the other side. So the West is rational, whereas the East is irrational, right? The West is progressive, whereas the East is either in arrested development or backwards. The West is peaceful, right, and kind of logical, right, whereas the East is, superstitious and violent. Westerners can control their sexuality, but these Eastern men can't. And that's also true of Eastern women. There's a whole kind of mythology about the Oriental woman. And actually, one of the things that I talk about in my book a little bit that I'd love to do some more work on is it's actually not just the Muslim woman, it's also the Oriental Jewess. So there's a whole kind of mythology about, this connected to these ideas about the East as a source of all life and knowledge. So like the Oriental woman is, so sexually powerful, she's dangerous, right? And then there's all this kind of stuff by the early Orientalists about that, right? And of course we see this in a lot of the imagery of the harem, right? And that sort of thing. So, it's something that, it's been around a couple hundred years, but it's still quite strong. I mean, people still talk as if we're living in the, late 1700s or 1800s.
So the Orientalism of the woman, going back to an earlier conversation we're having on the veil,
right?
It's part. I mean, could this be part of the Western desire of eliminating the veil so as to get to that sensuality of the woman?
Right. So So let me. I'm sorry. One of my kids was. Okay. Yeah, I mean, so one of the things that's kind of interesting about, you know, these ideas about the veil and what's written about the veil is, of course, it's all using this very sexual imagery, right? Like, we have to unrobe the woman, we have to take off the veil, right? And it's very, and you know, the language about the Orient is also very sexually charged. So the Orient, so there's this great, I don't have it in front of me, but there's a great quote, I think, by Edward Lane, who was this great, I mean, just obnoxious Orientalist, and he talks about when he, you know, first comes to the Orient, and it's like the bridegroom meeting the bride, and he can't wait to, you know, penetrate the land and all this kind of stuff, right? So the whole thing is very much framed in terms of gender, and so that's one of the reasons that Muslim men are depicted as these just kind of horrible people, right? Because they have to be, because then the white man has to come in and save the brown woman. I mean, this is like the same kind of stuff we find, you know, to validate Western expansion in the United States and kill American Indian men and invade Mexico and, right, take over Africa, right, is that these poor women have to be saved. Now, at the same time, even though they're oppressed, there's also this whole kind of thing going on about their sexuality, right? And so one of the interesting things about veiling in the harem is that because European men were not allowed access to the harem, they just made all this stuff up, right? So they would kind of have these big descriptions of the harem. Of course, they had no idea because they weren't allowed near the harem. Harem comes from the word haram, which means forbidden. So they would just kind of make this stuff up. So we don't, you know, there's some good work on, you know, what actually was the harem like, right? And what is the Western idea of it? And the Western idea of it is very much about all these kind of latent desires, right? So some of them are pretty intense, right? And, you know, Fanon did some of this work, right, up on what were the desires of French men about Algerian women, and
Right.
it's pretty disturbing because there's, you know, he was a therapist, right, and so like a lot of his patients talked about just really gruesome rape fantasies and stuff. So you see a lot of that in these depictions of the harem, right? So there's this, you know, this kind of thing about Muslim women, and to a lesser extent, you know, I think the Oriental Jewess is very much about possession, right? And so the way that women are talked about in Orientalist literature, whether it's fictionalized literature or travel narratives or whatever, is very much the way the land is talked about. I came to the Orient and she was beautiful. I am going to penetrate her. So you can kind of, yeah, and I'm like using light language.
No, absolutely. So this is kind of like what McClintock talks about, that the conquest of the land and of the people is done through the body of the woman.
Yeah, I think that's right. And there's a lot of, you know, good work on this about things like photography, right? So there's this really great book by, I think I have it here, by Maleka Lula called The Colonial, I think it's called The Colonial Harem, and it's about all these photographs that the French took of Algerian women. And they're like totally pornographic, right? And so as a way to kind of, you know, rip their culture apart, right, and destroy their culture through photography, right? And there's a lot of really good work on this, as you know. Yeah, I would agree with you.
Yeah. Okay. Maybe as we begin to wrap it up, and as we're talking about multiple women and all this stuff, I know, like, in some of the cultures, like I taught in South Africa, and I was with mostly a Islamic community while in South Africa, and some of the individuals I met had two wives. So polygamy is still not that. What was the word I'm thinking of? I'm sorry, I just had a brain freeze.
So polygamy is still practiced.
Yes, it's still practiced. It's still part. Right. So help me understand this within Islam, especially for students who might be Christian and looking at this and saying, "Oh no, what's going on here?"
Yeah, right. So I mean, okay, so before Islam, there's just kind of this unlimited use of women, right? Women are just kind of a commodity, right? And then...
And not to interrupt you, also within the Jewish Hebrew text, women were property.
Right. So there's this kind of debate about, what Prophet Muhammad was really saying, right, in his prophetic message. But, Islam limits the number of wives you can have to 4. But then there's these traditions surrounding Prophet Muhammad that say, he said things like, well, you can have 4, but you can't really treat more than one equally. Right? And so one of the things that some Islamic scholars take that to mean is that he knew they weren't ready for just having one wife. So he just was like, well, I'll just leave it at 4, right? Now, in his life, he was married, his first wife, Khadija, he was married only to her until she died. And people kind of thought that was very weird, right? And then after she died, he took on, a number of wives, but a lot of them were like elderly women whose husbands had been killed and that kind of stuff, right? And so that's kind of where this comes from, right? Is, in the Islamic tradition, we have this notion of, you can have up to 4 wives. Now, the majority of Muslims, I would say, probably in places like Indonesia, I think practice monogamy, mm-hmm. right? And they only have one wife. There are places where not only do people have 4 wives, but they have like 10. And one of the other things that happens a lot, and this is true at places like Afghanistan and some other places that are, horribly, horribly beset with problems like poverty and starvation and people freezing to death every winter and all that kind of business. There's very, very young girls that the family's like, if we don't sell her off, the rest of us will starve. And this is just like something that's horrific, right? Now, I think that it's important to remember that this is something that, for a lot of Muslims, it's just embarrassing. They're like, polygamy, right? And it's kind of like, my best friend is Mormon, right? My best friend is in the LDS church, and Muslims always have this, saying, oh, Mormons make the best friends for Muslim women, because we're like so similar, right? But she has a similar kind of thing about polygamy. She's like, there's those other Mormons, right? And I think a lot of Muslims kind of have this because, it is really problematic, right? And even if like the generation, the younger generation doesn't practice it, but their parents do, it does devalue women, I think, and it does kind of give some, license to men to be like, well, I'm not gonna marry 2 wives, but I'm gonna have these kind of women on the side, right? And so, it's still an issue for some Muslim communities, especially those that are in kind of, developing societies, right? And it's something that, I think it'll probably take a while before it's completely eliminated, right? I think one of the issues surrounding polygamy is that I think it does encourage, the kind of commodification, right, of women and girls, right? And a lot of these women a lot of these females that are in polygamous marriages enter the marriages extremely young, against their will. So it's something that, I'm being careful about what I'm saying here, right? Because I don't want to be too judgmental about it. But there's a lot of abuse tied to the practice, right? That's in the practice, right? And certainly it does still exist in some places, right? We can't deny that.
Yeah. So one last question. What can the West learn about sexuality from the Islamic community that can help us be more justice oriented?
Well, I think there's a couple things. I'm just going to jot down a couple notes here. Okay, so there's a few things. So we have, maybe not the healthiest sexual ethic, right, in some contemporary Muslim communities. But, there's a lot of Muslims that look to the example of the Prophet, who had a very healthy sexual appetite and liked to please his women, as the standard by how sexual relationships should go, right? So we know from and I hope this is okay to say in this class.
No,
right?
this class is X-rated. Don't worry. We're talking about all kinds of stuff in this class.
So I hope I don't blush here. So we know that we know from the Hadith, right? We know from these texts about the Prophet that he had a healthy sexual appetite. He enjoyed having sex. He was good at pleasing his wife or wives, right? And so we see how this kind of enters the tradition, and there's some really positive stuff to say about that, right? So in some legal systems, a woman can divorce her husband if he doesn't, give her orgasms, right? If he is not pleasing to her, and I mean that's really positive, right? At the same time, there's a lot, there's a whole history of sexual slavery in Islam, right? And Keisha Ali, who's this fantastic scholar, has written this classic text about it, right? That I always use in my Islam gender class. But certainly Muslims can look to not only the example of the Prophet, but there's these, they're kind of like sex manuals, right? That come out in the Middle Ages, right? A couple centuries after Islam comes on the scene, that are very detailed about, okay, well, this is exactly what you have to do with these different parts of your body to please your partner, right? And they aren't written just for the wife, right, or the concubine. They are written also for the men. You have to do these things. So, certainly there, I'm sure, are Muslims that have really unhealthy sexual relationships, and then there are Muslims that have really healthy sexual relationships, and sex is like very, very important part of the relationship, right? The other thing I think to say about this is, I think that I think there's some value there, right? I mean, that you can be religious, right? And you can be really devout, and you can really enjoy sex, right? And you can really love your partner, and you can express, all of this in that part of your relationship, right? And I think that's something that people could get from Islam if they took a closer look. The other thing I would say is I think that, I think that the kind of sexual ethic that we have from the Prophet's example, right, is very much that, he did respect the women he was with. And, this whole issue of the veil and how the veil is oppressive and how the veil is like punishing women and stuff, that's a very Western notion, right? But there are about a million other ways in Islam to practice modesty and respect. And I think those are things that are important, and maybe people that aren't Muslim could learn something. I don't wear the veil publicly, partially out of fear. Like, that's a huge part of it, especially living in this part of the country. I think if I lived in Northern California, things might be different. And certainly if I lived in a Muslim majority country, I would certainly wear it. I always do when I'm in a Muslim majority country. But, I also think that, there's a lot of other ways that Muslims, both men and women, practice modesty, right? And I think that, a lot of those ways actually are in our relationships with our spouses, right? And with our lovers. So I think that's probably something that, might be beneficial for other folks to look at. I think that without being judgmental here about, about the Western commodification of the female body, this is something that, Muslims living in the West really struggle with. I have we have a 9-year-old daughter. Both of our children, by the way, are biracial, and so there's a whole bunch of issues that comes up with their Muslim identity and their racial identity and all that. But she's 9, and she's already, wanting to go to Sephora and buy makeup and like all this kind of stuff, right? And this is something that, is difficult, right, for Muslims living in the West. And this very much has to do with sex. It very much has to do with the sexualization of children's bodies, right? That's really a struggle for us, right? Because it's like we want her to focus on her beautiful heart and soul and not worry about if she has enough sparkles on or, you know what I mean? So, I think there are definitely ways, without me being judgmental, about saying, boy, the way the West treats women's bodies is really atrocious, right? And not trying to place my own value, my own values, and me trying to control everybody's body, right? But just to say that, in Islam we do have a respect for at least some of us have a respect for women's bodies and the choices that they make, right? And I think that there's probably something that can be learned from that.
Good. Well, on that hope of learning from a different culture or different religious tradition about how we could even have a broader and better understanding of sexuality, I want to thank you for sharing these things with us.
Oh, my pleasure always to spend some time with my favorite colleagues. So
well,
anytime.
Thank you so much.